In my family, value was a number on a stock ticker. It was the square footage of a house, the brand name on a suit, the title on a business card. My father was a partner at a law firm. My mother managed a successful real estate agency. My older brother Ethan was a junior investment banker who spoke in a language of derivatives and capital gains I could never quite understand. Their world was clean, sharp, and profitable. And then there was me. I was the black sheep, the family's resident disappointment, the one with the art history degree and a quiet, unprofitable passion for junk. That's what they called it. The old books, the vintage radios, the forgotten paintings I loved, it was all just junk. A quaint hobby for the son who hadn't quite figured out how to be successful. My only ally, my only true kindred spirit, was my grandfather. He was the one who taught me that the most valuable things in life rarely come with a price tag. My family thought his greatest legacy was the small fortune he had built. They had no idea that his real treasure, the secret he had been keeping for a lifetime, was hidden in a pile of junk they couldn't wait to get rid of. My grandfather's garage was my real childhood home. It was a cathedral of forgotten things. The air smelled of old paper, tung oil, and the faint, metallic scent of ozone from the vintage radios he loved to tinker with. While my brother Ethan was at summer camps learning about leadership and networking, I was with my grandfather, learning about the quiet, beautiful language of the things people leave behind. He taught me how to identify the subtle grain of first edition book paper. He showed me how to read the maker's marks on the bottom of a piece of pottery. He taught me that the scuffs and scratches on an old piece of furniture weren't damage. They were a story. People only ever see the price, Sammy, he'd tell me, his voice a low, gentle rumble as he polished an old silver locket. You're the only one who sees the value. Never forget that. My family didn't understand our bond. They saw it as my failure to launch and his slow slide into senile eccentricity. Holiday dinners were a masterclass in their condescension. Ethan just closed a huge deal, my father would announce, beaming with pride. Tell them about the portfolio, son. And Ethan would launch into a monologue about hedge funds and market trends, and my parents would hang on to every word he said. Then the conversation would inevitably turn to me, the mood shifting from admiration to a kind of gentle, pitying concern. "And how about you, Sam?" my mother would ask, her voice a little too bright. "Still digging through those dusty old flea markets with your grandfather? Find any treasures?" The word treasures was always delivered with a faint, ironic smirk. "I found a beautiful set of hand-tinted photographs from the 1920s, I'd say, my own excitement feeling foolish in the face of their pragmatism. "That's nice, dear," she'd reply, before turning back to Ethan. "Now, about that new condo in the city." I wasn't just the black sheep, I was an alien, speaking a language they couldn't or wouldn't understand. They saw my passion not as a skill, but as a symptom of my failure to grasp what was truly important in life. The day he gave me the trunk, I knew it was important. He was getting frail, his movements slower, his voice softer. He led me up to the dusty, sun-drenched attic of his old house. In the corner, under a canvas sheet, was a large leather-bound steamer trunk with heavy brass clasps. It looked ancient. He handed me a small, ornate iron key. "Sam," he said, his hand resting on my shoulder. His grip was surprisingly firm. "There are going to be some changes soon. And when they happen, your family is going to show you exactly who they are. I want you to have this. Don't open it until after I'm gone. Just keep it safe for me." The way he said it, the look in his eyes, it was more than just a request. It was a mission, a final, secret piece of wisdom he was entrusting only to me. I helped him carry the trunk down to my car. It was incredibly heavy. It felt like it was filled with rocks. As I drove away, I saw him standing on his porch, watching me go, a sad, knowing smile on his face.
My grandfather passed away 2 months later. The grief was a physical weight, a hollow ache in the center of my chest. He had been my anchor, my champion, the one person who had seen me for who I was, not for who my family wanted me to be. The funeral was a performance. My family, dressed in their finest black, moved through the motions of grief with a practiced, somber elegance. Ethan, the new de facto patriarch, stood by my father's side, shaking hands, accepting condolences, looking every bit the responsible heir. My mother was a pillar of tragic grace. They were playing their parts perfectly. I just felt numb. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following week at my father's law office. The atmosphere was stiff and formal. We sat around a massive, polished mahogany conference table that felt as cold as a tombstone. The air was thick with a quiet, greedy anticipation. My brother Ethan was already talking about what they should do with Grandpa's house, whether to sell it or rent it out. They were dividing the spoils before the body was even cold. The lawyer, a dry, humorless man named Mr. Abernathy, cleared his throat and began to read. The language was dense and legalistic, but the meaning was clear. The house, a beautiful old Victorian on a double lot, was left to my parents. The stock portfolio, a considerable sum my grandfather had carefully built over 50 years, was left to my brother Ethan to manage on the family's behalf. The savings, the bonds, the physical assets, everything of tangible monetary value was neatly divided among them. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't even hurt. Not really. I had expected this. I had my grandfather's memories, his stories. That was my inheritance. And then Mr. Abernathy got to the final bequest. He paused, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at me with an expression that was a perfect blend of legal detachment and human pity. And finally, he read, his voice a flat monotone, "To my grandson Samuel, I leave my sincerest apologies for the family he was born into." I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. My grandfather's words, meant as a final act of solidarity, were being read aloud in this cold, sterile room. It was an intimate secret being exposed to a hostile audience. The lawyer continued, his voice unwavering. "And I bequeath to him all of my personal effects and collections currently stored in my attic, to do with as he sees fit." I looked across the table. My brother Ethan had a small, cruel smirk playing on his lips. He gave me a look that said it all. "See? Even in death, you're the one who gets the leftovers." My mother's face was a mask of polite, sorrowful pity, as if I had been handed a life sentence of dusty, worthless sentimentality. In that moment, in the eyes of my family, I had been officially, legally, and financially declared worthless. My inheritance wasn't an asset. It was a burden, a lifetime of junk to sift through. They thought they had won their final quiet victory, cementing my status as the family failure. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I just sat there, my face a blank mask, the weight of the old iron key in my pocket feeling heavier than ever. The next day, as my family was meeting with realtors and financial advisors, I drove to my grandfather's house one last time. The air in the old Victorian was still and silent, thick with the scent of his pipe tobacco and 100 years of dust. I didn't go there to grieve. I went there to work, to fulfill my final mission for him. I spent the entire day in the attic, the space that was now legally mine. It was a treasure trove of memories. I found his old army uniform, a box of my childhood drawings he had saved, his collection of vintage radios lined up on a shelf like silent, mechanical soldiers. I wasn't just clearing out junk, I was sifting through the evidence of a life well lived. Finally, I got to the trunk. It was tucked away in a corner, just as I had left it. I pulled the old iron key from my pocket. It slid into the lock with a satisfying click. I took a deep breath and lifted the heavy lid. The inside was filled with what, to anyone else, would have looked like more junk. It was packed with stacks of old comic books, wrapped in yellowed, brittle plastic sleeves, and dozens of dusty, cardboard-sleeved vinyl records. I gently lifted the first comic book from the top of the stack. My breath caught in my throat. The colors were still impossibly vibrant. A man in a blue suit and a red cape was lifting a car over his head. The title, in bold, familiar letters, read, Action Comics #1. My grandfather hadn't just collected junk. He'd been a secret, brilliant collector. I'd spent enough time with him to know what I was looking at. This wasn't just a comic book. This was the Holy Grail, the first appearance of Superman. My hands were trembling as I carefully went through the rest of the stack. There were near-mint copies of Detective Comics #27, the first appearance of Batman, Amazing Fantasy #15, the debut of Spider-Man, the crown jewels of the golden and silver ages of comics, all sitting here in a dusty trunk in a forgotten attic. Then I turned to the records. I slid the first one out of its sleeve. The label was a deep, iconic blue. It was a first pressing of Robert Johnson's King of the Delta Blues Singers. I knew from my research that there were only a handful of these known to exist in good condition. I went through the rest. Rare first-pressing vinyl from blues legends like Leadbelly, Howling Wolf, and Muddy Waters. It was a museum-quality collection. I sat back on my heels, surrounded by a fortune my family had dismissed as worthless. And then I understood. This wasn't an accident. This was my grandfather's final, magnificent act of rebellion. He knew my family. He knew they'd see a pile of old paper and dusty records and turn away in disdain. He knew they only saw the price, never the value. He had left his real fortune to the only person in the family who was equipped to recognize it. I found one last thing at the bottom of the trunk, a sealed, yellowed envelope with my name on it. I opened it. It was a letter from my grandfather, written in his familiar spidery hand. My dearest Sam, if you are reading this, then it means the vultures have finally claimed the carcass. Do not be sad for me, and do not be angry with them. They are who they are. They see the world in black and white, while you and I have always seen the color. I have left you my greatest treasures, not for their price, but for their stories. You are the keeper of the stories now. Do with them what you will. Just promise me you will build something beautiful. With all my love, Grandpa. Tears streamed down my face. He hadn't just left me a fortune. He had left me his trust, his final, quiet act of faith, and I knew exactly what I was going to do with it.
My first call wasn't to my family. It was to a high-end, internationally renowned auction house in New York. I spoke to a senior specialist in their collectibles department. I calmly described what I had found. At first, his tone was skeptical, the practiced patience of a man who deals with hopeful dreamers all day. Action Comics #1, you say? In what condition? Near mint, I replied. Stored in a dark, dry trunk for at least 50 years. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The skepticism vanished, replaced with a frantic, electric excitement. He agreed to fly out the very next day to inspect the collection in person. When the specialist, a small, immaculately dressed man named Mr. Sterling, saw the contents of the trunk spread out on my grandfather's old dining room table, his eyes went wide. He put on a pair of white cotton gloves and examined each piece with the reverence of a priest handling a holy relic. This is unprecedented," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "A find of this magnitude, in this condition? It's the stuff of legends." The auction was scheduled for 3 months later, and as Mr. Sterling had predicted, the story became a legend. It was picked up by the national news. Forgotten attic trove, dubbed the eccentrics hoard, could fetch millions at auction. That was how my family found out. The first call was from my brother, Ethan. His voice was a high, strangled sound, a mixture of rage and disbelief. "What is this, Sam? What did you do? You manipulated him. You tricked an old man into giving you everything." I said, "He gave me his junk, Ethan. You were there. You smirked. Remember?" Then my parents called, pleading, demanding, threatening. They were going to sue. They were going to contest the will. They claimed my grandfather was not of sound mind when he wrote it. But they were wrong. Mr. Abernathy, the lawyer, informed them that the will was ironclad, and my grandfather's final letter to me, which I had provided a notarized copy of, explicitly stated his intentions, making any claim of manipulation utterly baseless. They had no legal ground to stand on. Their greed had led them to discard a fortune, and there was nothing they could do about it. I went to the auction. It was a surreal experience. A grand, theatrical event in a room filled with wealthy collectors from around the world. I sat in the back, an anonymous spectator to the sale of my own new life. The bidding was fast, furious. The numbers on the screen climbed at a dizzying pace. When the auctioneer's gavel finally fell on the last item, the room erupted with applause. I just sat there, quiet, thinking of my grandfather. The final total was a number so large it felt abstract. It was more money than my family had inherited combined. I didn't buy a mansion. I didn't buy a sports car. The first thing I did was pay off my parents' mortgage, anonymously. It wasn't an act of forgiveness. It was an act of closure, an act of pity for people who could only see the price. Then, with the rest of the money, I started a foundation in my grandfather's name, the Theodore Grant for Young Artists and Collectors. It provides grants to people like me, people with impractical, unprofitable passions, people who see the value in the things the world discards as junk. Last week, our foundation gave its first grant to a young woman who wants to preserve the oral histories of her small, dying town. She sees the stories. She sees the value. My family doesn't speak to me. They can't. What would they say? But sometimes, late at night, I go into my own small workshop, filled with my own collection of beautiful, forgotten things, and I feel my grandfather there with me. We built something beautiful, just like he asked. We built a legacy, not of money, but of meaning. And that, I've learned, is the only kind of treasure that's truly priceless.